Once upon a time, in the ancient prehistoric year of 2013, a show would come out. A show that, for a very brief period of time, would take over the entire world. You could not go a single day without hearing about this show, whether it be in person or online. It was just inescapable. Everyone knew this show. Everyone loved this show. It was the biggest show in the world. And then, almost as soon as it took the world by storm, it just disappeared. Its relevance in pop culture would slowly but surely die down. Fewer and fewer people began to care about the show the longer it went on. And before you knew it, this once critically acclaimed, universally beloved show was now widely ridiculed all around the internet. If you even dared to say anything positive about this show nowadays, you would be ridiculed, no exceptions. It's gotten to a point where people look at this show and think, this was never good to begin with, why did we think this was good? This isn't an ordinary case of seasonal rot or anything like that, no. This isn't a show that had its moment in the spotlight and then just became irrelevant, but is still fairly popular, like you could still find fans of it. No, this was a show that used to be the biggest f***ing thing in the world, and now I see almost no one talk about it. I see almost no one acknowledge its existence, and on the rare instances where I see people talk about it, it's almost always in a negative light. Why is that the case, you might be asking? Well, that's what we're here for. We're gonna go over the history of this show to figure out why the show's reputation did a complete 180. This is the rise and fall of Rick and Morty. How the most critically acclaimed cartoon of the 2010s became a laughingstock on the internet. Let us begin. Rick and Morty is a show created by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland. The show first premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013, and upon its release, the show received near universal acclaim from critics and audiences alike. The show follows Rick Sanchez and his grandson Morty Smith, who are both intended to be parodies of Doc Brown and Marty McFly, the main characters of Back to the Future. Alongside the titular duo, you have Jerry, Morty's father, Beth, Morty's mother and Rick's daughter, and Summer, Morty's sister and Rick's granddaughter. There are tons of other characters on this show, and I mean tons of them, but these are the core 5 main characters of the show. Rick is a scientist, and so throughout the show, he and Morty travel through different universes and dimensions, coming across aliens, other variants of Rick and Morty, and just different weird, surreal, interdimensional beings in general. As mentioned before, the show was critically acclaimed, in part because of the surreal, unique nature that it had. When the show first came out, people praised how different and unique it was when compared to other adult cartoons. It was seen as this breath of fresh air adult cartoon, and it very quickly became the flagship show for Adult Swim. Now, despite being universally acclaimed when it first came out, Rick and Morty wasn't exactly mainstream, if that makes sense. In its early days, Rick and Morty didn't really have much of a presence on social media, despite being universally acclaimed. You gotta remember that the internet was a very different place in 2014 and 2015 when compared to how it would be in the years to come. As the years went by, Rick and Morty started growing more and more in popularity. Its fan base would keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's with this where we can move on to the meat and potatoes of this topic. 2017. arguably the year that Rick and Morty broke out into the mainstream. And even if it was already mainstream beforehand, this was undeniably the year that Rick and Morty peaked in popularity. 2017 would be a milestone year for the show for a multitude of reasons. Number one, this would be the year that the third season of the show would premiere. And looking at the massive fan base that the show had garnered in the time between 2013 to 2017, that naturally made a lot of people hungry for season 3. People were just waiting for it to finally come out, to finally premiere, to finally get more of the genius writing from Dan and Justin. Actually, that might be poor wording on my part. You're gonna see why in a little bit. Now, even though 2017 was the year that Rick and Morty peaked in popularity, it would also be the year where people would start to look at the show a little bit differently. The aforementioned season 3 of the show, again, premiered in 2017, and I remember even back during that time, there were people that thought season 3 wasn't as good as the first 2 seasons. I would see people say that, season 3 was still good, but it just wasn't as great as seasons 1 or 2. And then I would also find people that thought season 3 was terrible and a massive downgrade from the first 2 seasons. In retrospect, a lot of people point to season 3 as being when the show went downhill. The infamous Pickle Rick episode, which would indeed come from season 3, I would say was the moment that the show jumped the shark. And that's saying a lot considering the fact that Rick and Morty is meant to be a weird, surreal, over-the-top cartoon. The kind of cartoon where they jump the shark in every episode. So for me to say that Pickle Rick was when the show jumped the shark, that is saying a lot right there. That is saying a lot. But the main focus of this segment isn't the show itself. No, it's the fan base that the show garnered. Now, as previously mentioned, Rick and Morty was growing more and more in popularity, and that would naturally mean that its fan base would just continue to grow more and more as well. And as a result of this would lead to both the fan base and the show itself garnering a reputation of sorts. In retrospect, I like to consider 2017 the final year of the cringe era. You know that era where everyone looked at certain things and were like, oh, this is cringe, this is cancer, this makes me want to drink bleach, am I right, guys? You think of edgy 2016 era YouTube, pyrocynical, Leafy is here, Filthy Frank, stuff like that. People would look at certain things and think, oh, this is cringe, why do people like this? It's so cringe, guys, it's cringe, am I right? My Little Pony is cringe. Sonic is cringe. Why do people like these cringy things? They're cringe, guys. I'm gonna make a cringe compilation talking about how cringy these cringy things are. And Rick and Morty would have the misfortune of being one of the final victims of cringe culture before it would just die down. The cringe era, I think, lasted from 2014 to 2017. Maybe a little bit of it was still alive in 2018, but to a significantly lesser extent. But by 2019, cringe culture was largely dead, with the very minor exception of those Fortnite is bad memes from around that time, which, ironically enough, those themselves are cringe. And unlike many other things that were called cringy during this time, like Minecraft, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Undertale, Rick and Morty would never recover from the cringe reputation that it had garnered. There would never be a re-evaluation for Rick and Morty. Nobody would look at Rick and Morty and think, hey, you know what, this is actually kind of good. I don't know why I called it cringe, in the same way people did for Five Nights at Freddy's and Minecraft. The moment Rick and Morty became cringe, it forever stayed cringe. Its reputation would never improve. So let's talk about that, shall we? There were three primary reasons as to why the Rick and Morty fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has now. And I think it only makes sense to start with probably the least bad of the three. I don't know. It's still admittedly cringy and embarrassing, but it's relatively harmless in a way when compared to the other two reasons. I am of course talking about the Rick and Morty musicallys. And now some of you could be asking, what the hell is a musically? Well, let me explain it to you. Remember Vine? Remember when Vine was a thing? Got really big around 2013, 2014, I don't know, and then it shut down in 2016. Now, how many of y'all know about this little obscure app called TikTok? I'm sure most of you have. You've probably never heard of it. It's this very unknown, obscure app. Well, in between Vine's shutdown and the rise of TikTok, there was Musical.ly, the forgotten, lesser-known middle child of the three. Musical.ly was intended as a spiritual successor to Vine after it was shut down in 2016. It was pretty big in 2017, however in 2018 it would end up being rebranded to TikTok. It would end up being rebranded to the app that we all know and love, hate, I don't know, today. I want to imagine there are a lot of people that are nostalgic for the Vine era. Maybe there are people that are nostalgic for when they made Vines themselves. Maybe they're nostalgic for a lot of the memes that would come out of the Vine era. And TikTok is, well, I mean, it's TikTok. It doesn't really need much of an introduction. You already know it. But nobody remembers Musical.ly. It's just a thing that came and went, and even though Musical.ly technically still lives on in the form of TikTok, no one remembers how TikTok was during its early stages. But anyways, during its very brief existence, Musical.ly had one big trend attached to it: Rick and Morty. A lot of people would dress up as characters from Rick and Morty, usually the titular duo themselves. And a lot of them would just be them lip-syncing. Maybe it could be them lip-syncing to a song, lip-syncing to a scene from the show, that sort of thing. Basic TikTok fare, even though this was before TikTok. Most people, though, didn't really take a liking to this. This was something that the internet thought was cringe and lame and uncool. And admittedly, a lot of these musicallys, it's so hard for me to not refer to them as TikToks because they're technically not TikToks. Yeah, they are admittedly pretty embarrassing. I could imagine an alternate universe where it's like I had a Musical.ly account and I would make like these Rick and Morty musicallys. I would like dress up as Morty, lip-singing to a random song, and then years later I would look back on this time and I would think, oh god, this was embarrassing. It's normal, it happens. But even though a lot of these are really stupid and dumb and admittedly cringe, they're mostly just harmless. They're just people having fun. People dressing up as their favorite characters and just lip-singing to a song or reenacting a scene from the show, that sort of thing. And to be honest, on very rare occasions, there would be Rick and Morty musicallys that weren't really all that cringe. I mean, just look at this guy. He's just dancing. He's just busting a move. Let him be. Let him do his own thing. Nothing wrong with that at all. Of course, though, a lot of people on the internet looked at these musicallys and thought this was cringy. This sets a bad image for the Rick and Morty fanbase. Big YouTubers like PewDiePie, Pyrocynical, and I Hate Everything would all make videos during this time talking about the Rick and Morty fanbase, giving particular attention to the musicallys, believing that they made both the normal fans of Rick and Morty and Rick and Morty itself look bad.
My children, as of late, the internet has come under attack by an unspeakable evil. A force so great with its darkness, it threatens to consume all of mankind. Men, women, children, memes, no one is safe from this horde of monstrosity. Because today, I will be talking about the Rick and Morty fan base.
It's kind of ironic that I bring up PewDiePie in this, considering the fact that he himself would end up having a Reddit reputation soon after. What the hell is a Reddit reputation, you may be asking? Well, I'll explain what that is when we get there. As I mentioned before though, a lot of these musicallys were just people reenacting scenes from the show, and yet these were seen as cringe and unfunny, even though they're literally just the exact same thing as from the original show. Like, take this one for example.
I have a new catchphrase.
Oh yeah? What's that, Rick?
I love my grandkids.
Oh.
Psych, just kidding. My new catchphrase is, I don't give a
Just
let me see what you...
How did this happen? How did this come?
I don't give a
Just
let me see what you...
I just don't understand. Like, it's Rick and Morty. It doesn't make any sense. Why do you do this? Stop.
The original scene of that from the show would be considered funny and hilarious, but because it's two people reenacting it in real life on Musical.ly, it was considered dumb and cringy and unfunny, even though it's almost essentially the exact same thing. I'm not bringing this up to point out that like, oh, these people are hypocrites, double standards, etc. I'm not saying that at all, because again, you gotta remember, this was 2017, this was a very different time. I'm pointing out this specific detail mainly because it would unintentionally foreshadow the way that people would look at Rick and Morty in the future. It would foreshadow the way that people looked at Rick and Morty's style of humor. The aforementioned videos that I brought up all praise Rick and Morty, acknowledging that even if it did have a terrible fan base, it was still a good show.
Rick and Morty is an amazing show, honestly one of the best animated series I've watched for an incredibly long time. For the most part, the jokes punch, the characters are likable when they need to be, and totally putrid, hated, and despised also. Yeah, Jerry, shut up, Jerry. Jerry's the new Meg. Shut up, Jerry!
I think Rick and Morty's a good show. It's funny, creative, nihilistic, weird, and endearingly parodies many elements of pop culture that we all enjoy. It's a likable and goofy show.
Listen, you've seen Rick and Morty, okay? And if you haven't, you should, because it's a really good cartoon. It's really good, and it deserves to get all the praise and all the love it's get. But god damn, it has the worst fan base of all time, and I'm PewDiePie, and I'm saying that, okay? That should tell you enough. It's worse than The Undertale. It's worse than Five Nights at Freddy's. I have not seen anything this bad in years.
Yeah, that's how you know this video was made in 2017, when he brings up Five Nights at Freddy's and Undertale as examples of cringy fandoms. God, 2017 really was a different time, wasn't it? Of course, this is all stuff that I will go into further detail about much later on in this video. But yeah, Musical.ly was a thing. If you forgot that Musical.ly existed, now you remember it existed. And there were a lot of Rick and Morty musicallys that were being made, and I mean a lot of them. And for better or worse, when Musical.ly became TikTok, this trend did not carry on over. And yes, admittedly, a lot of these are very cringy, embarrassing. I want to imagine the people that made these back in 2017, they would look back on them and think, yeah, this is embarrassing, why did I do this? Now, this really shouldn't go without saying, but please do not go out of your way to harass any of the people that made these musicallys. I feel like this isn't really as effective as I would like it to be because this is a defunct social media app, but still, I'd rather be safe and put that out there. I know that these are cringy, they're embarrassing and whatever, but they're ultimately just harmless. They're just people having fun. They're not hurting anyone by making these. It's not worth harassing these people just because they made a couple dumb but harmless shorts based on a now irrelevant cartoon on a defunct social media app from 7 years ago. It's just not worth it at all. You're better than that. I know it. That being said, now I think it's time to look at the second reason as to why Rick and Morty's fanbase garnered a bad reputation. And let me just say, this next reason is going to be a lot cringier in comparison to the musicallys. Now, as I mentioned numerous times before, 2017 was a milestone year for the show. It was arguably the year that Rick and Morty truly broke out into the mainstream, and it became largely popular on a lot of different social media websites, including Reddit. Now, I'd say around this time, or maybe shortly after, Reddit would start to develop a pretty bad reputation online, which, to be honest, isn't really saying much nowadays, considering the fact that I'm pretty sure all social media apps and websites and whatever have bad reputations nowadays, but I believe Reddit was the first one to develop a negative reputation online. Rick and Morty, given the many science fiction themes it has, would end up attracting a largely nerd fan base. Now, it's important for me to note that around this time, nerd culture would start to change drastically. The idea of being a nerd was becoming a lot more appropriated. It was becoming normalized. Back in the 2000s, if you said you liked Star Wars in middle school, you would likely be stuffed into a locker. In the late 2010s, though, if you said you liked Star Wars in middle school, people would be like, oh, I love Star Wars as well. I think it's great. I think it's amazing. And sometime in the late 2010s, Reddit began developing this reputation for being full of nerds and neckbeards and whatever. The idea of being a Redditor and a Rick and Morty fan began to overlap with each other, to the point where the two were basically synonymous with each other. And because of this, there was a belief that popped up out of nowhere that Rick and Morty was a show for smart people. You needed to have a high IQ, you needed to be highly intelligent in order to understand the comedic writing of Dan and Justin. Rick and Morty wasn't just a simple comedy, it wasn't a simple parody of Back to the Future. No. It was a deep show full of genius, well-written humor that only people with high IQs could understand. A lot of these people looked up to Rick Sanchez as a role model, as a hero, even though the whole point of his character is that he's meant to be a terrible person. You know that whole phenomenon where people worship and look up to Patrick Bateman from American Psycho or Walter White from Breaking Bad, even though the point is that they are meant to be terrible people? Yeah, something like that would happen with Rick Sanchez. Rick would become among these characters that people would look up to, people would idolize, even though they are terrible people. They are not role models, they are not characters that you are supposed to look up to. What didn't help things out either was the pessimistic, nihilistic, nothing in life matters, why should we care about anything style of humor that Rick has in the show. I guess this resonated with a lot of these pretentious freaks, and so they decided to adapt that into their lifestyle. And so rather bizarrely, these people tried to turn Rick and Morty into something that it wasn't. A deep, serious show for people with high IQs. People began posting all of these memes and whatever, quotes from the show, thinking, oh, it's so deep and whatever. Rick and Morty is a deep show for high IQ people. And maybe at first glance you look at this and you think, okay, yeah, maybe this could be a little bit deep. But then you remember that this is the same show that has a character literally named Mr. Poopy Butthole. And that's when you realize, no, Rick and Morty is not a deep, smart show or anything like that. It's a fucking comedy. It's meant to make you laugh. Maybe there are a few serious moments sprinkled in here and there, but Rick and Morty is generally a comedy. To these people though, Rick and Morty was so much more than a comedy. It was a work of art. It was something genius, something that you needed to be super smart in order to understand. It was a show that was full of deep, meaningful quotes like this: "Roses are dead, love is fake, weddings are just basically funerals with cake." Oh man, that's super deep. I'm not even gonna lie. I hate when I go to a wedding and I see a fucking dead body there, That always sucks, doesn't it? Who can relate? And there's no way I can talk about the stereotype that Rick and Morty is only for smart people without bringing up the copypasta. At some point in 2017, someone left a comment on a Reddit post, where else would they leave it, giving birth to one of the most infamous copypastas on the internet. To be fair, you need to have a high IQ in order to understand Rick and Morty. No, I cannot be bothered to read the whole thing. The moment this comment was made, it was hit with instant ridicule, just like that. Nobody took this comment seriously. Nobody took the belief that Rick and Morty was for smart people seriously. Tons and tons of memes would be made making fun of those that thought Rick and Morty was for highly intellectual people. Joke copypastas and memes and whatever would be made claiming that shows like Jimmy Neutron or Johnny Test were actually for smart people and not Rick and Morty. It was a crazy time. You just had to be there. To be fair, I could say that for a lot of the stuff in this video. You just simply had to be there. It's crazy to think that there are people that have yet to get into Rick and Morty, people that are only now starting to watch the show, that have just completely missed out on this point in time. They watch the show and they think it's a funny Back to the Future parody, and it's like they don't know anything about this stuff. About the musicallys, about the pretentious belief that the show was for smart people, about the third thing that we are going to be talking about in just a little bit. They just watch the show and they like it and they think it's funny, and that's it. And that's a crazy thought to me, I'm not even gonna lie. But with all of that said though, it's time to move on to the third and final reason as to why the Rick and Morty fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has today. 2 words. Sichuan sauce. If you know, you know. If you don't know, well, allow me to explain it to you. Back in 1998, to promote the then upcoming Disney movie Mulan, McDonald's released a limited time sauce known as the Sichuan sauce. The sauce would end up being largely forgotten about, as would be the case with a lot of fast food promotional stuff, until almost 20 years later, when it would be brought up in the first episode of season 3 for Rick and Morty. And it was with this that the Sichuan sauce would end up becoming a massive inside joke within the fandom. People began demanding that McDonald's bring back the Sichuan sauce, and eventually they did. Around the latter half of 2017, around September to October or so, McDonald's actually did bring back the Sichuan sauce for a limited time. Something that they didn't take into consideration though was how massive the Rick and Morty fandom was. I remember back when this was going on, I would find videos of people just lining up at different McDonald's locations, people just standing outside demanding that they wanted the Sichuan sauce, even if the location that they were at was either out of Sichuan sauce, or they never had it to begin with, or they had a very limited amount. I came across a video of people rioting over a McDonald's not having Sichuan sauce, and apparently it seemed that the cops were involved with it as well, which is f***ing crazy to me. In retrospect, it feels even weirder looking at these videos now because it just shows you how massive Rick and Morty was at the time, and the fact that now it has fallen into complete irrelevancy is just, it feels so weird to me, I'm not even gonna lie. I look at this video and then I look at how Rick and Morty is nowadays and I just get reminded, oh yeah, Rick and Morty used to be the biggest thing in the world. That was a thing that happened. Of course though, I cannot talk about the Sichuan sauce stuff without bringing up this also infamous video of a guy freaking out at a public McDonald's restaurant because they didn't have the Sichuan sauce. Here's the video.
Wait, you guys know Sichuan sauce? No. I want Sichuan sauce. Where's my Sichuan sauce? I'm Pickle Rick! One below Dum Dum! I'm Pickle Rick! 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 I'm Pickle Rick! Rick! Rick!
What the heck? What? In retrospect, I'm pretty sure this was the video that single-handedly ruined Rick and Morty's reputation. Thanks to this one video, Rick and Morty went from being the most acclaimed cartoon of the 2010s to a complete joke, a laughingstock all over the internet. Rick and Morty would never be taken seriously again thanks to this video. And there you have it, folks, the 3 big reasons as to why Rick and Morty's fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has now. At first, people were willing to let the terrible nature of this fanbase slide because the show was good, but sooner or later, people would realize that maybe the show itself wasn't any better than the fandom it had. I'll get into that much later on. Even back then, I thought it was really weird to me to see how this show all of a sudden garnered this massively cringy fan base. Again, you gotta remember, the show came out in 2013. The fan base didn't become cringy, or at least it wasn't considered cringy until 2017. Between 2013 to 2016, I saw almost no one talk about the Rick and Morty fan base in a negative way. I guess this could just, again, be the result of Rick and Morty becoming much more popular. Even though Rick and Morty was already universally acclaimed from the start, I guess it was comparatively more niche for its first 2 seasons, and then season 3 was when the show finally broke out into the mainstream. And so naturally that would lead to the fan base of the show garnering a cringy reputation. Whatever the case may be, these 3 things not only ruined the reputation of the Rick and Morty fan base, but it also ruined the reputation of Rick and Morty itself. 2017 to 2018 was the peak of the show, I would say. It was still massively popular in 2018, but then by 2019, the show was just nowhere near as big as it was. There was a massive, noticeable decrease in popularity starting in 2019. By the time season 4 premiered in November of 2019, Rick and Morty was no longer the pop culture phenomenon that it was just 2 years prior in 2017. Admittedly, I could just be misremembering this, or maybe I'm being biased. Maybe this is how I personally remember it, even though it's not how it actually was. But season 4 of the show didn't feel as big when compared to the first 3 seasons. Like, the hype surrounding it was just not on the same level. I want to imagine the show was still fairly popular during this time. There were still people that were excited for it, but it didn't feel as monumental as it did for season 3, and I think the cringy reputation that the show was starting to get greatly affected that. The same thing would happen with season 5 in 2021, season 6 in 2022, season 7 in 2023, and probably all future seasons from here on out. They just kind of came and went. They didn't feel as massive as the first 3 seasons, especially season 3. So let's talk about how Rick and Morty struggled to stay relevant in the early 2020s before eventually 100% permanently cementing itself as a complete joke all around the internet. Throughout the early 2020s, slowly but surely, Rick and Morty would fade away into irrelevancy. I remember back in 2017 and 2018, people would be talking about Rick and Morty. People would be talking about whatever new episode had come out the night before. People online would be speculating about the show. I would go outside, I would see people wearing Rick and Morty shirts and whatever. I would see people joke around saying, you know, wubba lubba dub dub, I'm Pickle Rick, I'm Mr. Meeseeks, etc. And then by the early 2020s, I just didn't see anyone do that at all. It was now considered cringe and uncool to do that. I'm pretty sure the last time Rick and Morty was ever remotely relevant in pop culture was in 2021, when Soulja Boy, yes, Soulja Boy of all artists, made a song about the show. It became a viral TikTok hit, but as with 99% of all viral TikTok hits, it ended up not having much longevity, especially considering the fact that compared to other viral TikTok hits, this one is explicitly more of a novelty song. The craziest thing is, the song isn't that terrible, kind of. The lyrics are, well, I mean, if you were expecting good lyrics from a Soulja Boy song about Rick and Morty, that's on you. I don't know what else to say. But the beat is actually, like, surprisingly good. I can't play it because of copyright reasons, but this song actually has a surprisingly really good beat. And I don't know if I want to say it's wasted on this song or if it's used perfectly on this song. The bottom line is, though, it's exactly as good as a Soulja Boy song about Rick and Morty could possibly get, and that's the most I can say about it. It truly is one of the songs ever made. Unfortunately, it came out long after Rick and Morty was even close to being relevant. If this had come out in 2018, it probably would have been a bigger song, especially considering the fact that TikTok came out in 2018. Could you imagine if this was like one of the first big viral songs on TikTok, and how different the world would be if that happened? Remember back when TikTok was this brand new app and there were like 2 viral songs on it already? That really cringy I'm Already Tracer song, and that somehow even worse Hit or Miss song. God, what a time that was, wasn't it? You could say a lot of things about TikTok and how it is nowadays, but at least it's not this anymore. At least it's not this. And there you have it. The last time Rick and Morty was ever remotely relevant in pop culture. It's crazy to think that in 2017, Rick and Morty was the biggest show in the world. Everyone knew Rick and Morty, everyone loved Rick and Morty. And then you cut to just 4 years later in 2021, and it's like the only reason people still remotely care about this show in this time is a TikTok novelty song from a rapper that peaked in the late 2000s. That is hilarious and depressing at the same time. Of course, though, this wouldn't truly further escalate until late 2022, when a certain game would come out called High on Life, which is from Justin Roiland, one of the 2 creators of Rick and Morty. High on Life is a first-person shooter featuring talking guns. Guns that retain the trademark humor that Justin Roiland is known for on Rick and Morty. It's worth noting that in addition to co-creating the show, Justin Roiland also provided the voices for the titular duo. The main gun that you have in the game is this blue gun, which is basically Morty. It's a game where you run around with a talking gun, and the gun sounds exactly like Morty. It has the same sort of humor that you would find in Rick and Morty, stuttering, squeaky voices, etc.
Yeah, sorry about the spit. I needed to get you infected with the translator microbes. That's sort of how it works. I guess you guys don't have those here yet. Listen, my name's Kenny. I'm a Gatlian. We gotta move.
What is it?
High on Life is meant to be a comedic game. It's a first-person shooter, but it's also meant to be a funny one. The problem is, though, a lot of people didn't look at it as a very funny game. Now keep in mind, this game came out in late 2022. By this point, Rick and Morty had already fallen deep into irrelevancy. The days of Rick and Morty being this massive pop culture phenomenon were long behind us. However, the unfunny nature nature of this game made people realize something. Maybe Rick and Morty was never really all that funny to begin with. This game has the same style of humor as Rick and Morty, but a lot of people thought it wasn't really that funny. Therefore, that would lead people into thinking, maybe Rick and Morty actually isn't that funny. The same people that were praising the show just a few years prior were now turning back on it and thinking, yeah, no, this show isn't that funny. This also came during a time when a lot of people would be critical about the dialogue that would be in certain movies and video games and whatnot. Around this time, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's reputation was also going downhill very rapidly, and that was in part because of the poor dialogue and the poor style of humor that these movies were having. The whole, well, that just happened style of humor that these movies were now becoming infamous for. And then in early 2023, you would have that game, Forspoken, which would end up being widely lambasted on the internet because of its cringy, unfunny dialogue.
Did I just do that?
Well, definitely with my assistance.
I did not just do that.
We did.
I just moved with my mind.
Perhaps our connection has somehow awoken some abilities.
I just moved with my mind.
I just keep hearing I.
I just moved with my freaking mind! Yeah, okay, that is something I do now. I do magic, talk to sentient cuffs, kill jacked up beasts. You know what? I'll probably fly next.
Now you're just being ridiculous.
Oh, that's too far. Good to know there's a line.
If you could just master these new abilities, with my help, of course.
Did you not just see me take out that gnarly beast?
The cynical, nothing in life matters nihilism that Rick had in the show was also being frowned upon in retrospect as well. People began to feel that a lot of media nowadays feels too sarcastic and pessimistic. Nothing felt sincere anymore. And this would be further highlighted when shortly after High on Life came out, a little show would be released called Velma, which would end up being widely hated as well for a multitude of reasons, namely the unlikable, cynical nature of the show's main character. People couldn't stand the pessimistic, unlikable nature of Velma's humor. The same pessimistic style of humor that they were praising Rick and Morty for having just a few years prior. Suddenly people wanted things to turn around and change. And it was with this game that public perception on Rick and Morty would change drastically. People went from thinking Rick and Morty is one of the best cartoons ever made, I love it, wubba lubba dub dub, to thinking, okay, Rick and Morty has a bit of a cringy fan base, but it's still an amazing show, I'm Pickle Rick, to thinking Rick and Morty is garbage, and its fan base is garbage as well. They're both unfunny as hell. It's actually kind of amazing to me that this is what made people think Rick and Morty wasn't funny in retrospect. It wasn't the cringy fan base or seasonal rot or anything like that. No, what made people turn against Rick and Morty's style of humor was an almost completely unrelated game that just so happened to be from one of the two creators of Rick and Morty. Speaking of seasonal rot, let's briefly talk about that. While yes, the general consensus nowadays is that Rick and Morty was never good to begin with, I guess you could say that yeah, Rick and Morty also did go through some form of seasonal rot. It went through seasonal rot much faster than, say, Family Guy or The Simpsons, but it still went through seasonal rot nonetheless. On the rare instances where I see people acknowledge Rick and Morty as a good show, they usually only acknowledge the first few seasons as being good. I've seen people say that the first two seasons are the only good seasons of the show, and that the show went downhill starting with season 3, which I can understand for a multitude of reasons, mostly stuff that I've brought up throughout this video. Season 3 had the infamous Pickle Rick episode. Season 3 started the Sichuan sauce bullcrap. Season 3 was when the show broke out into the mainstream, and subsequently it would garner a much bigger but also much cringier fan base that would damage the show's reputation. I can definitely see why people would refer to season 3 as when Rick and Morty started going downhill. Despite that though, I've also seen people say that season 3 was the last good season of the show, and that season 4 was when the show truly went downhill, which I could also understand given how much of a non-event season 4 was when compared to season 3, in part because of how much the show's reputation had changed in the short time between season 3 and season 4. It's almost crazy looking at how much the perception of this show changed between mid-2017 to late 2019. Generally though, I've seen people say that like Rick and Morty was never that good of a show to begin with. In retrospect, it's not very funny, it's cringy, it has an annoying fan base, stuff like that. Around this time though, people began noticing something with some of the later episodes of the show, primarily like season 5, season 6, I'm not sure. There were a concerningly large number of I-word jokes in the show all of a sudden. I don't even know if I could say the word without getting demonetized, but I ain't gonna take that risk. When I say I-word, I'm talking, you know, Sweet Home Alabama, you know, that I-word. And all that did was make people turn away even more from the show. So in addition to the same old style of humor that Rick and Morty had from the very beginning that we now thought was unfunny because of High on Life, there was also a whole lot of Sweet Home Alabama throughout the show for some reason. But that's not all. If Rick and Morty somehow wasn't already considered a joke by then, what would happen in early 2023 would be the final nail in the coffin for the show's reputation. Something would happen that would permanently cement its status as a laughingstock on the internet. In early 2023, allegations would come out against the aforementioned co-creator of the show, Justin Roiland. Domestic abuse allegations to be exact. Now, I don't want to go over the exact details of the allegations because I don't want the video to get demonetized or even taken down, and I could be wrong on this, but I think there were other allegations as well against Justin Roiland besides the domestic allegations, but I'm not entirely sure. In a case of morbid irony, this was probably the first time in years that people actually cared about Rick and Morty, and it was for the worst possible news you could think of. Now admittedly, I'm not entirely sure if these allegations against Justin Roiland ended up being true or not. I think the verdict found Justin not guilty, but I'm not entirely sure at all. Whatever the case may be though, this would end up further damaging the reputation of the show, to the point where shortly after the allegations became public, Adult Swim announced that they had cut ties with Justin Roiland. Season 7 would be the first season of Rick and Morty to not have Justin Roiland involved at all. As mentioned before, Justin Roiland provided the voice of the two title characters, and now they were about to be recasted. Now, I have to state that these allegations are no laughing matter at all. This is not something that should be joked about at all. If you want to say that you don't like this show because of these allegations, in the sense that like you cannot watch this show anymore and enjoy it without thinking about what Justin allegedly did, that's perfectly fine. That's reasonable, that's normal. But to use these allegations as a joke for how Rick and Morty is bad is just, like, come on man, that's not right. Of course though, the internet being the internet decided to turn this into a joke despite that, further damaging the reputation of the show, turning it into even more of a laughingstock than it already was. At the same time though, when it was announced that season 7 would be the first season without Justin's involvement, that made people wonder, could Rick and Morty become good? Season 7 could have either become become the first good season of the show in years, or the first good season in general. Maybe not having Justin involved with season 7 could help save the show's reputation. Unfortunately though, that ended up not being the case. When the allegations were made public in early 2023, it was pretty big news, as was the announcement that season 7 would be the first season without Justin Roiland's involvement. When season 7 premiered at the end of 2023 though, it was just radio silence and that's it. Crickets. Nothing at all. I saw literally nobody talk about season 7 when it came out at the end of 2023. It turns out getting rid of Justin Roiland was not enough to save the show's reputation. It wasn't enough to regain the show's initial popularity. And so here we are today in 2024, 7 years after Rick and Morty's prime. The downfall of Rick and Morty is just staggering to me because it's like how does this happen? How does this even happen? I remember back in the late 2010s, Rick and Morty was everywhere. It was the biggest show in the world. Everyone knew it, everyone loved it. Nowadays though, I see almost no one talk about the show at all. I see almost no one acknowledge it at all. Nobody talks about the show, nobody makes videos on it, nobody makes memes of it anymore, nothing like that. I would even go as far as to say that at this point, Rick and Morty is no longer the big thing for Adult Swim. That honor now goes to Smiling Friends. I understand that a lot of shows cannot stay at the top of popularity forever. Rick and Morty was going to have its moment in the spotlight and then it would just leave the spotlight. It would still remain massively popular, but it wouldn't have the same mainstream success that it had in 2017. There are very few shows out there that still remain massively popular long after they ended. Shows that haven't had new episodes in years, and yet they're still just as popular now as they were when they were actually having new episodes coming out. For the case of something like Breaking Bad, Breaking Bad ended almost 11 years ago now, and I'd say it's even more popular now than it was when it was airing. I understand that trends change. Pop culture is always changing. I understand that Rick and Morty's pop culture dominance in 2017 wasn't going to last forever. There would come a point in time where it would decline in popularity naturally. In the same way shows like The Simpsons or Family Guy would decline in popularity. Back in the 90s, it felt like a massive event when a new episode of The Simpsons first aired. Nowadays, a new episode of The Simpsons airing is just a thing that happens. No one cares about it, no one makes a big deal about it, it's just there and that's it. And Rick and Morty would eventually end up like that, and that's normal. But the thing that gets to me is the fact that Rick and Morty fell off so f***ing hard that like all of the critical acclaim it once had, all of the pop culture relevancy it once had, it's now just disappeared. It's been retconned out of existence like it never even happened. The Simpsons is nowhere near as good as it used to be back in the 90s. The Simpsons has been mediocre to bad for far longer than it's been good, but I'd argue it still has a place in pop culture. No matter how bad the modern episodes of The Simpsons get, you will still see people acknowledge that the show was good at one point. All of the iconic moments and episodes from the classic seasons, they will forever be remembered. The quality of the modern episodes have no impact on these classic episodes. I think it goes without saying that steamed hams will be one of those memes that just never dies. One of those select few memes alongside Rickrolling and Lost where it will just live on forever. It will never die. There's something weirdly beautiful beautiful to me about the fact that a show that will seemingly never die having a meme that will also seemingly never die, but that's beside the point. Rick and Morty is not like this at all. The cringy fan base, the allegations against Justin Roiland, the belief people had that Rick and Morty isn't all that funny, the classic seasonal rot belief. Maybe there's people that think Rick and Morty was never funny, but it became even worse in its later seasons. There's just a lot of things that contribute to Rick and Morty falling from grace. You still see people talk about The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, etc. You don't see anyone talk about Rick and Morty anymore. I don't know if this is like an Avatar situation where it was massively successful, but it's left behind no cultural impact, because Rick and Morty did leave behind an impact on pop culture. A massive impact, I'd say, but now it's just seemingly been erased. It's been retconned out of history like it never happened. Like, yeah, we never liked Rick and Morty. We always thought it was garbage from the start. I made a bold prediction recently that Has-Been Hotel, another controversial, polarizing adult cartoon, will end up suffering the same fate as Rick and Morty. Right now, everyone loves Has-Been Hotel. Everyone thinks it's this breath of fresh air adult cartoon, but about 4 to 5 years from now, people will look back on Has-Been Hotel and they'll think, wow, this is f***ing garbage. Why did we like this? Whatever critical acclaim and pop culture relevancy that Has-Been Hotel has or will have, it's going to be erased from history, just like with Rick and Morty. People will look at the excessive swearing in Has-Been Hotel and they're gonna find it unfunny in retrospect, in the same way we find Rick's nihilistic style of humor unfunny nowadays. It's almost incredible looking at the parallels between these two shows. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse for Rick and Morty, very recently, the first episode of a Rick and Morty anime was released. Yes, there is an honest-to-God anime based on Rick and Morty now. We got a Rick and Morty anime before we got GTA 6. What the hell is taking them so long to put out this game? Seriously. Currently, only one episode of this show has been released, and I've heard literally no one talk about it at all. I've barely seen anyone talk about it, which it just tells you so much, you know? It tells you a lot about how Rick and Morty is seen now in 2024. If this was back in like 2019, everyone would have ate it up and be like, whoa, this is the greatest thing ever, you know? Redditors would be having a field day with this. But in 2024, it's just, you know, what's the point? Why bother making it? And from what I've heard, this anime is apparently really terrible. Again, there's only one episode so far at the time of making this, so there's a small chance that maybe things could turn around for the second episode. Maybe things could become better, but who knows really. Maybe I might make a video on this, maybe I won't. If I consider High Guardian Spice to be searched for the worst cartoon material despite supposedly being an anime, then you know what? Sure, Rick and Morty the anime is fair game as well. I don't care. Sometimes I can break the rules. Sometimes I can bend the rules to my liking. The idea of making a Rick and Morty anime in the first place sounds like a Redditor's wet dream from 2018, and not a real thing that we would get in 2024. Apparently not even the very few people that still like Rick and Morty in 2024 think this anime is good, assuming they even know that this anime exists, so it's just a disaster all around. And again, I feel like I've said this a million times already, but this is going to do nothing but further ruin the reputation of Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty will always forever be seen as that cringy cartoon for pretentious Redditors that was created by an unfunny abuser. A massive far cry from what the show was considered during its early days. ways. A fresh, unique, and hilarious adult cartoon. A breath of fresh air for adult animation. As for me personally, what do I personally think of Rick and Morty? Well, if you can believe it, I never watched much of it actually. Back in 2017, during the peak of the show, I watched most of the first season and that was it. And yeah, I thought it was really good at the time. If I rewatch it now, I'm probably not going to enjoy it as much for obvious reasons, but I thought it was a funny show at the time. I never bothered to watch the rest of the show though, and I'm not sure why. Considering how bad the show's reputation is nowadays, I'm probably not going to watch it at all. If you even dare to say that you like Rick and Morty nowadays, if you dare to acknowledge that Rick and Morty was good at some point, you will be ridiculed just like that. Now, even though I haven't watched much of the show, and I most likely never will, I did try to make this video as largely unbiased as I possibly could. My personal opinions on the show, I feel, are not really all that important when it comes to talking about its downfall. If I loved the show, if I hated the show, it didn't matter either way. I would still be presenting everything that I've said in this video the same way, because that's just how it was. Obviously, when I say that nobody likes Rick and Morty anymore, everyone thinks it's bad, that's obviously hyperbole. There are still fans of Rick and Morty out there, undeniably, but it's like so minuscule nowadays when compared to how giant it was in the late 2010s. It's just the fact that people back then thought Wubba Lubba Dub Dub and Get Swifty and whatever, we thought that was funny, and now we don't think it's funny anymore. We think it's cringy and embarrassing. But that's what a lot of people on the internet think. That's not what I personally think. What I personally think doesn't really matter in this instance. I didn't make this video because I hate Rick and Morty or anything like that. I made this video because I'm just interested by this topic. What the hell even happened to Rick and Morty? How did this go from being the most critically acclaimed modern cartoon, a critical darling within the animation community, to just a complete laughingstock all over the internet? What the hell happened? I was there to witness everything. The Musical.lys, the Sichuan sauce freakouts, the people that were criticizing these things, calling them cringy and saying that like, oh, that this is gonna ruin the show's reputation. I was there to witness all of the memes people were making about like, oh, Rick and Morty is for smart people, you need to have a high IQ in order to understand it. I was there to see all the memes of people making fun of that. One of my first ever YouTube videos was a cringe compilation on Rick and Morty. That should just tell you everything right there. We've come full circle. And so it wasn't until recently that I remembered all of this, and it made me realize, what the hell even happened to Rick and Morty? It made me realize that I've not seen anyone talk about Rick and Morty in a long time. And on the rare instances where I see people talk about Rick and Morty, it's always in a negative light. And then I remembered everything with the fan base, all that stuff, you know. High on Life came out and people thought that was unfunny, and I guess that just retroactively made people think Rick and Morty was unfunny as well. You know, like, I remembered all of that stuff. And so I thought that this would make for a very interesting video topic. And well, here we are now. With that being said though, I'm looking forward to Season 8 coming out later this year and receiving zero attention from the internet when it actually comes out. I guarantee you Season 8 is just gonna come and go like it never even happened. And it just makes you think, how long will it be before Rick and Morty finally enters that Simpsons Family Guy phase where it's like, oh my god, how many more episodes are they gonna keep making? How long is the show gonna go on for? When are they just gonna end it already? Which is mind-boggling to me considering the fact that Rick and Morty is a far more recent show and it has significantly fewer episodes than both Family Guy and The Simpsons. But alas, this is the story of Rick and Morty. This is the story of how what was once the biggest cartoon in the entire world very quickly became a laughingstock all over the internet, to the point where any critical acclaim and pop culture relevance that the show might have once had was completely erased, completely undone, like it never even happened to begin with. And to think that it all started just because he turned himself into a pickle. He's Pickle Rick now. Funniest shit I've ever seen. Now that's some high IQ humor right there. Only a real genius could understand the complexity of this joke. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoy this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Wubba lubba dub dub.